So moving along here, we're looking now at the same situation of ace 8 deuce rainbow, except here we're looking now at the hijack against the small blind. And one thing we can already see is that this equity disparity between the small blind and the hijack is much closer. And we know this to be because the small blind's range is much tighter. Look at this range compared to that of what the big blinds was. All of those suited hands were in, many more offsuit hands. So, particularly due to the fact that the range is tighter and very much containing many of these ace-x holdings, we see that the ranges are much more overlapped. And it's interesting here, we can actually pull this in and look at this section of the range where there's kind of like almost it's this like 50th to 75th percentile more or less that the hijack is really holding over the small blind. This particular section, it almost has a 2-to-1 type effect. And I think the reason is that, yeah, the hijack's range has a bit more of these kinds of hands, middle pair, weak top pair, whereas the small blind has more like kind of, king high, strong king high. They have the middle pairs, but then they have the under pairs. So it's always interesting how different ranges match up at different sections of where they intersect with one another. And let's go ahead and see how the strategies shift. So here we see more checking because of that equity competition. The imposition player has less of an advantage, and as such, they can't bet as often. Because they can't bet as often, we see they do like to bet a bigger size a little bit more frequently than when we compare it to how they were playing against the big blind. Still primarily betting small because it is a board that has that, sort of either you have an ace or an eight or you're just like kind of unlikely to catch up, that kind of classically coined way ahead, way behind type situation. But then we do see some checking here where, naturally that was not happening earlier. We can explore a similar line of a check raise, and we can look at some different turns and kind of just see what's doing here. So because the range is tighter overall, the check raises are coming in a little bit more frequently. And let's see how the imposition player is responding, relatively speaking. Not all that different of a strategy. Still these backdoor hands sticking around. Still, any pair on the board calling, these under pairs kind of indifferent right away. Let's see how things shift. Yeah, so the 3 is still very good. Let's put a different turn in though. Let's put in a 10. Oops. Let's put in a 10. See how that looks. So a rainbow 10. This should be a better turn card for the imposition player than the out of position player. Yeah, they're doing a lot more checking. They're playing a more polarized approach. Sometimes when the out of position player who has check raise bluffed the flop and turns a pair, they will continue bluffing. But the 10 is a bit too strong because now it has showdown value against the 8. And we can potentially prove this theory if we look at, let's try a 7. I don't know if this is going to pan out as intended, but I'm thinking with 9-7 suited, yeah, okay. There's a little bit of bluffing going on. 6-7 suited. These hands, also 4-5 suited, picking up a double gut shot. That's definitely significant as well. But you can see all of these ideas contribute to generally how the ranges interact with one another and how they interact with the board. So one thing I wanted to do here was check how the small blind plays against under the gun, and again just kind of highlight more of the relativity of these ranges and really what we're looking to accomplish when we explore these solutions, which largely, we always do seek to understand the game in kind of our time of studying, but really when we play hands that we're unsure about, that's when I think the lessons stick the hardest, because there's a bit of an emotional attachment to the scenario that we found ourselves in. So here we see the small blind has a little bit less equity because the under the gun range is tighter, right? This range is tighter than the hijack range. And we're still not range betting it, which I think a lot of players would. And I don't think it's necessarily a terrible idea. And the main reason for that is because a lot of players won't play as aggressively as the out of position player. So when we face this small bet, a lot of players won't raise as often as is suggested here. So we see this, 50% pot raise coming in 18% of the time. A lot of players simply won't do that. They won't take 8-7 and raise. They won't take 4-5 suited. All that one's like not terribly hard to find because it's a gut shot. Pocket fours, that's kind of a goofy hand to find to raise with. And when I say find, I mean kind of end up in this situation and be compelled to take that aggressive action. So yeah, the less often that you face an aggressive action from your opponents, the more often you yourself can play aggressively. And this is a good reminder for pre-flop strategies because the more that you, let me restate that. The less often that your opponents 3-bet you, the more often you can raise. And some players say like, oh, if I get called a lot, like I should raise less. And it's like, well, you're not going to always win the pot, but when your opponents play too many hands and play them passively, that's a great situation. That's kind of a dream scenario because what's going to end up happening is you get to be in post-flop situations with players whose ranges are too wide. When their ranges are too wide, your range has a much greater equity advantage. What that allows you to do is have a lot more success with your aggression. Now, the counterpoint some players make is, but those players who have those wide ranges don't fold. And to that I say, great, we just value bet them into oblivion. Now, when you say they don't fold, you mean they don't fold hands that have connected. But if the board is somewhat disconnected, where the cards are disparate from one another in rank, they're not going to be able to connect all that often. And if a player plays too many suited hands, they're often going to turn up here with queen 6 suited. Or, any suited hand that just doesn't really connect very well. So that's a big advantage for us when our opponents don't play aggressively enough, and sort of bringing us back to the point here, if they don't play aggressively enough on the flop, we can bet more often than was suggested, which, 25% of the range checking, it's not insignificant, but we certainly don't mind simplifying to a range bet. And, again, we see kind of this sliding scale, the living, breathing organism of strategy. You really could call it the octopus itself. It kind of is what the strategy is. It has this adaptable component in nature to it. Anyhow, there's less big betting here. The desire to bet big when we have a stronger range on this disconnected board has been diminished. Let's plug a different board. So we're looking at the under the gun strategy. Actually, before we do that, let's look at kind of the same situation we have been, where the check raise comes in. And, oh, actually, sorry, I'm getting too excited. Yeah, so here now, some of the pairs are indifferent right away. Some of these backdoor straight draw hands, I mean, actually with the backdoor straight draw, backdoor flush draw, we're still very much in. But basically there's a little bit more folding because of the tightness of the ranges. The small blind range against the under the gun open are the two tightest ranges that we've looked at so far. So when the opener range is tighter and the calling range is tighter, right, the minimization of ranges as the hand continues, we've already minimized the percent of total hands that each player has to get to this decision point to such a degree that there's more hesitation to put chips in the pot for both players. But let's choose a different flop. Let's choose something a little bit more coordinated and kind of just see how that is going to affect things. And I think this might be useful for a lot of players. We can, again, draw up another comparative. We can move this then to the button and kind of see. And this is really the goal when we study, right? We want to understand that relative component of the game. How are things changing as we shift around in different positions, different board textures? And that's why, for me, I love this aspect of poker so much, because no matter how many hands I play, no matter how many situations I see, no matter how much I study, there's a literal endless well of information that is yet to be tapped, and really no one can ever tap it in their entire life. It is far too vast. So this board is really good for the under the gun player. 65% equity. Even though the small blind range is tight, these three Broadway cards are just so strong. And as such, we see, a full-on range bet here. Kind of somewhat partial towards the smaller bet, but not to a huge degree. Now let's change one thing here. Let's take away the king of diamonds. Let's put the king of hearts. Now remember, we had 65 to 35% equity. Let's see how the equities change. And let's see what sort of the main components which shift are. So the small blind equity has gone up a little bit because now the presence of the flush draw allows for this player who had the weaker range to catch up more often. It's easier for them to improve their hand. And we see here now a very big shift, which is that the under the gun player no longer wants to bet the bigger size because they can't retain their equity, right? That dynamicism component is yet again coming into play. The ability for them to keep their strong hands as strong as they are on turn and river, now we're touching on that idea of having foresight for the future betting streets, is significantly less pronounced because the heart can come and it will not completely torch the equity of the imposition player, but it will prevent them from as comfortably betting as aggressively with their strongest hands. And we can look here and see that the imposition player here has a flush draw 6% of the time, and the out of position player has a flush draw 8% of the time. So, proportionally, that's pretty significant. Let's go ahead and switch this around to the button and see how things change. And it's going to be quite interesting, I think, for a number of reasons. So right off the bat, what do we see? Well, equities are nearly 50-50, right? Button is 51%, small blind has 49%. There's basically competition the whole way. And this is heavily highlighted in the fact that the small blind is actually leading out around 30% of the time because the equities are running so close together and they have so many strong hands relative to the button's wider range, right? Look at this range for the button. Compare this to what the under the gun range looked like. I'm sure if you haven't already, you can now start to see very clearly how significant the range analysis and composition component of problem solving really is. Insofar as choosing strategic choices, we really need to be able to understand what kind of ranges we have and what kind of ranges we're up against. So kind of if we look here, the strategy at a glance, kind of the whole way through the equity portion, except at the very bottom end, we're choosing bets with a wide variety of holdings. And we see kind of the smattering on the grid as well. We're not taking 6, 7 of spades on this board with a weak backdoor flush draw, but if we have hearts or we have a 10 for open-ended straight draw, some pairs, we're benefiting from betting. One thing to keep in mind now, as we've sort of touched on, this cat and mouse idea within strategies, if we don't bet out as the small blind, the button should be even more hesitant to bet themselves, right? So this strategy should drop in betting frequency if the small blind doesn't bet out, because now the small blind has more stronger hands. This equity disparity will be closer to 50-50. There'll be less equity for the button to push, whereas when the small blind includes bets in their range, when they split this range, and this is their checking range, as opposed to this entire subset of holdings being their checking range, it means that in this decision point, I understand we're kind of back in the abstract a little bit, but this is important. The button here is going to have a lesser equity. They won't have 54% equity. Their equity will drop a little bit. And as such, because it's zero-sum equity, the small blind's equity will go up. And that's really significant because it means that the button will have to deal with the fact that the small blind has more stronger hands. But the reason that the small blind was betting in the first place is because the button is already hesitant. So we don't really want to make them more hesitant. If that makes sense. We're kind of always playing off this idea of striking while the iron is hot. And this is really, truly just an endless well of delving into different situations, learning more about heuristics, thresholds, inflection points, understanding the equity distributions, what the different betting strategies are, what the incentives are for different players, how the subsets exist and match up, what kinds of bet sizes we want to use. And there's no world in which I could go into such depth as to deliver to everyone watching all of the possible ideas that are contained within the game tree, which is immeasurably large, of poker, and no limit hold'em tournaments specifically. So I think really the goal should be, if this speaks to you, come use the platform and learn for yourself. Like, the goal is that we empower people to learn for themselves. You can share the simulations either within the platform or grab the link here and send it to another user, and they'll be able to see that exact node. And you can actually leave chat and notes for yourself or for others about specific aspects of the tree and what it means for you. And as soon as we have the trainer up and running, we'll then be able to actually play against the computer, and that just makes the learning process go parabolic because it's actually simulating real gameplay. So although our opponents won't play exactly like that, it's kind of like going to the gym for your poker mind. Going to the dojo is sort of the way I like to think about it. So I'll do one last thing. I thought this would be fun before sort of wrapping up these examples. I'm going to put in myself. I'll just review a couple of my own hands and try to draw some similarities between what we're discussing here and let's see. Go to some big pots. I already reviewed some of these. Let's go to... Yeah, this was an interesting one. So this was heads up in the 300k Super High Roller Bowl. So in heads up, interesting to note that there is no ICM. We're both guaranteed second place money, and we're playing winner take all. So it's really just whoever, wins the tournament, wins first place money, and we both know what we sacrifice when we lose. We just get second. So Ike limped in here with his Jack 10 suited, and I raised it up with my King Jack offsuit, which seems pretty standard, and he called. So here, Ike is at maybe not the full-on top of his limp calling a raise range, but his hand is very strong given the circumstances. He could have a suited ace. There's a lot of hands he could have, but this is just a very strong hand for the circumstance. My hand is kind of well within my range, but let's say, it's not the absolute top. It's in maybe like the, I don't know, top like 2/3 or something. It's strong, but it's not like, it's not amazing. So let me get this Jack 10 deuce board, rainbow. And what are the considerations? Well, what's the stack to pot ratio, right? We go back to our checklists. It's a little bit under 5. Now, what's like the equity distribution here? And what are the incentives for me? Well, this board is rainbow. So because I have the stronger range, that's good for me. Particularly if I choose to bet with my strong range, because I'm going to retain my equity better. Now, this Jack 10 deuce, the double Broadway boards, particularly in these out of position nodes where we've taken an aggressive action and our opponent has called us in position, sometimes these boards can lead to extremely aggressive strategies, particularly if there's a flush draw. Because of the dynamicism, we oftentimes will just shove for many times the pot. However, here with the rainbow nature of the board, I thought it made more sense to choose a large but not so committing size. Not that I'm at all sort of unhappy about the strength of my hand, even though I happen to be behind. That's kind of an afterthought. My hand is so strong that I'm basically considering that I have the nuts here for all intents and purposes. So I went for just a pot-sized bet. My thought here was that I would play a very polarized strategy, and because a lot of hands that I would raise here don't connect with the board so well that I want to bet at a high frequency, and also because the jack and the 10 are quite connected, I want to make sure that when I bet here, I really pressure Ike. So again, this idea of the connected cards and the out of position nature, even though there's no flush draw, there is still a relatively dynamic component to the board. So I went for this big bet. Ike, we have a low stack to pot ratio. His hand is very strong. He shouldn't have any concerns about me outdrawing him. He should want to kind of keep in my worst hands and keep his range strong. So we're seeing like a real kind of practical example now of the idea of passive play being a strength. Trapping, keeping ranges wider, and yeah, kind of waiting, deferring action to future streets to see what happens. So the 9 is interesting, right? It does increase dynamicism. Now there's a flush draw. We do have the jack of clubs, limiting some possible holdings of Ike, which would be of, the 2 club nature. And I actually recall that the better strategy here was just to shove. My thought in game was that I wouldn't really have enough hands that had high equity, which would want to shove as a bluff or semi-bluff. And that's really what is happening at a high level. We're always thinking about, if we have strong hands, how do our weaker hands want to play? If we have a weak hand, how do our stronger hands want to play? And we create that sort of inextricable link between the strong and the weak hands so that our opponents can't exploit us and figure out what we have. This is the rock, paper, scissors element of poker. You want to make your opponent indifferent. You want to make them indifferent with certain parts of their range, definitely, but you want to make them also uncertain, I should say. You want to create uncertainty for them, and actually the more you can force them to create uncertainty for themselves, the better off you are, because then they're tricking themselves on your behalf. So I went for a smaller bet. Again, I think this was sort of not a great play. As I kind of mentioned, I had the wrong idea. I think it would have been better to choose a slightly larger bet size, but I was aware that the 9 is it's a relevant interacting card, and my thoughts here were kind of to start to target hands that Ike might have, like a 10. Like, let's say he has a 10-7 suited. Let's say he has a hand like a 9, like a queen 9 or an 8-9. My thought, anytime you're betting on the smaller side, you're always targeting like the weaker parts of your opponent's range. So my thought was that this was an appropriate bet size, and Ike just called again, which, I think if he shoved, it would have been a very awkward situation for me, because there's not that many semi-bluffs that he can really have when I myself choose such a big flop bet size. For him to arrive at the turn, his range has already been tightened quite a bit. And that's why I got a bit lucky now that 7 came on the river. I felt that I can't really shove for value. It becomes too thin. It's not hard for him to have an 8. He can have 10-8 suited. He can have 8-9. He could have slow played a straight on the turn. He could have a hand like he has, which is already beating me the whole way through. So I went for the check, and then he shoved. And really now it just becomes that game again, right? Like, do they have it? Do they not? I'm bluff catching. Like, Ike never has queen jack or a worse hand for value. He either has a bluff or he has, a better hand than me. And really the only hands that I could think of here that would be bluffing were maybe a 10 with clubs. It depends how good he thinks the 7 is, insofar as a river card goes for his range. And if he has a hand like queen 9 or queen deuce suited was going through my mind, or maybe a hand like, 10, 6 of clubs, I guess. It's possible that he could turn those hands into a bluff. I mean, he definitely would turn them into a bluff at some clip. It just depends kind of what his thoughts are about the spot. We're in a very sort of funky, intricate node here. Node being decision point. I know I've used that word a few times and kind of forgot to clarify, but yeah, the thought here really is it's just hard for him to have enough bluffs, because the bet I made on the flop was just very large, and then for him to get to the river here, there's just only so many hands. So again, just highlighting the relativity of the game, and I think that I made a prudent fold, and I'm glad I did. Certainly got a bit lucky with the run out, actually. It's funny, when you're sitting there with king jack in game, you're thinking, oh man, like the 9 is not good, the 7's not good, but actually it saved me from myself, because if blanks came out, I would have been out of the tournament here. And just kind of, in closing, a good reminder that you really never know what worse luck your perceived bad luck is saving you from. Sometimes it's actually just the universe helping you, lending a helping hand towards not going broke in a certain situation. So yeah, I just want to thank everyone for watching, and I sincerely hope that this was enjoyable to you, and there will be a lot more content coming. And I would say that this is, kind of my very best attempt at creating a structural theoretical framework for everyone, and the future content will probably be a bit more on the intuitive side, and pursue some of the softer skills of the game, and definitely some more abstract ideas that I think everybody will very much enjoy. So yeah, thanks again, and much love.